July 1942. The heat in Papua New Guinea does not just sit on the skin, it penetrates the pores, a heavy, suffocating blanket of moisture that smells of rotting vegetation, ancient mud, and by the end of this story, the distinct copper tang of industrialized slaughter. History books will tell you the Kokoda Trail campaign was a battle for Australia's survival, a strategic chessboard maneuvered by generals in air-conditioned offices in Brisbane and Tokyo. But the truth, the visceral bleeding truth found in the waterlogged pages of a diary, recovered 60 years later from a collapsed fighting pit near Isurava, tells a different story. It was not a battle for territory. It was a descent into a primal, hallucinogenic hell where the rules of 20th century warfare dissolved into knife fights in the mud and dying men drowning in their own lungs. The diary belonged to Corporal Takeshi Ito of the Imperial Japanese Army's 144th Infantry Regiment. For decades, the narrative has been about the Australian spirit, the diggers holding the line. But Ito's diary reveals the other side of that coin, the creeping, paralyzing dread that took hold of the Emperor's finest shock troops. It speaks of a specific Australian tactic, not a grand flanking maneuver or a technological breakthrough, but a psychological weapon born of desperation and geography that broke the minds of men who had never known defeat. This is not a story of heroism. It is an autopsy of 96 days of terror. To understand the fear that gripped Corporal Ito, we must first strip away the newsreel footage of smiling troops and patriotic songs. We must go to the mud. The Owen Stanley Range is not a mountain chain in the European sense. It is a razor-backed spine of prehistoric volcanic ridges rising nearly 4,000 meters into the clouds, covered in jungle so dense that at noon the forest floor is bathed in a perpetual gloaming twilight. It is a place where nature is hostile to human life. The indigenous people knew to tread lightly here. In July 1942, two modern armies decided to feed thousands of young men into this green grinder. On the southern side, the Australians, specifically the 39th Battalion. They were militia conscripts derisively called chokos by the volunteer AIF veterans, chocolate soldiers expected to melt in the heat of battle. They were young, barely trained, equipped with World War I surplus rifles and khaki uniforms that turned into heavy, wet shrouds in the jungle humidity. Among them was Private Arthur Bluey Thompson, a 19-year-old railway clerk from suburban Melbourne who had never held a weapon in anger, whose understanding of war came from the sanitized letters his father wrote home in 1918. Thompson, like the rest of the 39th, was sent to Port Moresby as a garrison force, a token effort to secure the northern approach to the Australian mainland. They were boys playing soldiers, digging latrines and complaining about the food, unaware that just across the Solomon Sea a force was gathering that would turn their boredom into a nightmare. That force was the South Seas Detachment, commanded by Major General Tomitaro Horii. These were not conscripts. They were hardened veterans of the China campaign and the conquest of Rabaul. They were the tip of the Japanese spear, undefeated, drunk on victory, believing explicitly in their spiritual superiority and the divine wind that guided their bayonets. Corporal Ito was one of them. His early diary entries from the transport ship are filled with a terrifying confidence. He writes of the weakness of the Western spirit, of the inevitability of the rising sun flying over Port Moresby, and then inevitably over Australia itself. He describes the cleaning of his Arisaka Type 38 rifle not as a chore, but as a religious ritual. To Ito, the Australians were a formality, a speed bump on the road to glory. The plan was audacious: land at Gona on the northern coast of Papua, march over the Owen Stanley Range via the Kokoda Trail, and take Port Moresby by land, bypassing the formidable Allied naval defences. It was a plan drawn on a map by men who had never seen the jungle. It assumed the mountains were just lines of elevation, not vertical walls of slick mud and tangled roots. It assumed the track was a road, not a goat path that narrowed to the width of a single boot. On July 21st, the Japanese landed. The horror began not with a bang, but with a slow, creeping realization of the environment. As Ito stepped off the landing craft onto the black sand of Gona, the humidity hit him like a physical blow. He writes of the air being too thick to breathe, and the immediate assault of mosquitoes, clouds of them, descending on exposed flesh. But the morale held. They were the Emperor's chosen. They moved inland, pushing aside the small Australian patrols, confident, aggressive. The 39th Battalion, strung out along the track, began to engage. This is where the narrative shifts. This is where the tactic begins to emerge, not as a coherent strategy from high command, but as an organic, desperate evolution of fighting for survival. The Australians, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, could not stand and fight a pitched battle. If they dug in, the Japanese, masters of infiltration and jungle movement, would simply slip around their flanks in the dense undergrowth and butcher them from behind. So the 39th learned to run, but not a rout, a fighting withdrawal. They would set an ambush at a bend in the track, a choke point where the jungle pressed in tight. They would wait, silent, buried in the leaf litter, letting the Japanese point man, often a local guide forced into service or a sacrificial scout, pass within touching distance. They would wait for the main body, the officers, the NCOs, like Ito. Then, a sudden, violent eruption of Bren gunfire and grenades, 30 seconds of chaotic slaughter, and then silence. By the time the Japanese reorganized and returned fire, the Australians were gone, vanished into the green mist, falling back to the next ridge, the next bend, to do it all over again. To Corporal Ito, this was infuriating. It was cowardly. It was dishonorable. He writes on July 29th, "The enemy refuses to fight. They bite like fleas and run away. They are afraid of our steel." He did not yet understand that this was the strategy. He did not yet understand that the Australians were trading space for time, bleeding the Japanese advance, forcing them to deploy, fight, reorganize, and march again, mile after agonizing mile, while their supply lines stretched to the breaking point. The terrain began to take its toll. The Golden Staircase, a series of roughly cut steps reinforced with rotting logs, ascending 2,000 feet straight up into the mist, became a torture device. Ito describes the weight of his pack, the ammunition, the rice rations, cutting into his shoulders until the skin was raw and bleeding. The mud was not just dirt and water. It was a living, sucking entity. It pulled boots off feet. It worked its way into sores, causing tropical ulcers that ate flesh down to the bone. Men began to drop not from bullets, but from exhaustion, and the Australians kept hitting them. Private Thompson, the clerk from Melbourne, was no longer a boy. In the span of a week, he had aged 10 years. He had seen his friends blown apart by mortar fire. He had killed men at close range, watching the light go out in their eyes. The choco had melted away, leaving something harder, colder underneath. The 39th was disintegrating physically, ravaged by dysentery and malaria, starving as their own supply lines faltered, but they were holding the mind of the enemy hostage. They created a phantom army. A few dozen men with a Bren gun could sound like a company in the echoing acoustics of the jungle valleys. They made the Japanese believe they were facing a massive entrenched force, causing Hori to pause, to delay, to bring up artillery that he couldn't afford to transport. This delay was the weapon. Every hour the Japanese paused was an hour the sickness had to work on them. Every night they spent shivering in the freezing rain of the high altitudes was a night their morale chipped away. The diary of Corporal Ito changes tone in early August. The bravado vanishes. The entries become shorter, more erratic. He stops writing about the emperor and starts writing about food. "Rice is gone," he scrawls. "We eat roots. The water makes us sick, but we cannot stop. The officers beat those who fall." He mentions the green shadows, the Australians. "They are no longer fleas. They are ghosts. We do not see them," Ito writes. "We only see the muzzle flashes. We walk into death every day. My squad is half gone. Tanaka died screaming today, his stomach open. There was no doctor, we left him in the mud." The psychological impact of the Australian tactic, the ambush and retreat, was amplified by the jungle night. Darkness in the Owen Stanley Range is absolute. You cannot see your hand in front of your face. The silence is heavy, broken only by the dripping of water and the screech of insects. But for the Japanese, the silence was filled with the anticipation of the next attack. The Australians, operating on home ground in a sense, familiarizing themselves with the terrain as they retreated, would sometimes slip back through the lines at night, not to attack, but to harass. A grenade thrown into a sleeping pit, a single shot fired into the dark. It denied the Japanese sleep. It kept them in a state of perpetual adrenaline-fueled anxiety. Sleep deprivation induces psychosis. It breaks the will faster than hunger. Ito describes hallucinations. He sees demons in the trees. He hears the voices of his ancestors telling him to turn back. "The jungle is eating us," he writes. "The Australians are the teeth." By the time the Japanese reached Kokoda village, the airfield that was their first major objective, They were a ragged shadow of the parade ground army that had landed at Gona. They took the village, yes. The Australians fell back again, surrendering the ground, but it was a hollow victory. The airfield was unusable. The supplies weren't coming, and the Australians were still there just up the track at a place called Isurava, digging in, waiting. This is where the campaign shifted from a fighting withdrawal to a meat grinder. Isurava was the cork in the bottle. The 39th Battalion, now emaciated, their uniforms rotting off their bodies, were joined by the first units of the AIF, the veterans of the 214th Battalion returning from the Middle East. These were big men, desert fighters, confident. But even they were shocked by the state of the militia boys. They saw the vacant 1,000-yard stares of men who had been living in hell for a month. Private Thompson, now a skeleton with a rifle, looked at these newcomers with a mix of relief and pity. He knew what was coming. He knew the Japanese were massing for a push that would either break the line or break the Japanese army. Corporal Ito knew it too. His diary entry from August 26th, the day the Battle of Isurava began, is a single terrifying line. "We are ordered to die tomorrow. I hope it is quick." The battle that followed was 4 days of medieval savagery. It was fought at close quarters, with bayonets, rifle butts and fists in mud so deep that dead bodies did not fall, they simply sank. The Australians used the terrain to funnel the Japanese attacks into kill zones. The Japanese, adhering to their doctrine of offensive spirit, threw themselves into these zones in human wave attacks. Ito describes the sound of the Australian Vickers machine guns as a canvas tearing, a continuous ripping noise that sawed men in half. He describes climbing over the bodies of his comrades to get at the enemy, slipping on blood and entrails. The tactic had evolved again. It was no longer just hit and run. It was stand and die. The Australians held Isurava until they were physically pushed off the ridge by the sheer weight of Japanese numbers. But the cost for the Japanese was catastrophic. They had expended their best men, their ammunition, and their energy to take a few hundred yards of mud, and when they finally cleared the ridge, looking for the collapse of the Australian force, they found nothing. The Australians had vanished again, fallen back to the next ridge, ready to do it all over again. The psychological blow was devastating. Ito writes of the despair that swept through the ranks. "They are not human," he says of the Australians. "They are mud spirits. We kill them, and they rise up again further back. We are walking into a trap that has no end." The fear was not just of death, it was of the futility. The Japanese soldier was conditioned to accept death if it brought victory. But this was death for nothing. This was death for a patch of jungle that looked exactly like the patch of jungle they had died for yesterday. The Australian command, particularly the controversial General Blamey back in Australia, did not understand this. They saw the map. They saw the retreat. They accused the men of the 39th of running like rabbits. They did not see the genius of the delay. They did not see that Private Thompson and his mates were stretching the elastic of the Japanese supply line until it was taut, ready to snap. They were buying time for the logistics war to turn. While the Japanese were eating maggot-infested rice and dying of beriberi, the Australians were slowly, painfully building up their strength. The rabbit line was actually a noose, and Corporal Ito was feeling it tighten around his neck. September came, bringing more rain. The track turned into a slurry. The Japanese advance slowed to a crawl. They were now within sight of the lights of Port Moresby. They could see the objective. It was right there, shimmering in the distance at night, but they could not reach it. They were a spent force. The tactic had worked. The terror of the track, the constant harassment, the disease, the starvation, had hollowed them out. Ito's diary entries become fragmented, delusional. He writes to his mother, apologizing for not sending money. He writes about a feast he had in Tokyo 3 years ago, describing the taste of the fish in minute detail, while he chews on dried bark to stave off the hunger pangs. He describes the Australian soldiers not as enemies, but as fellow sufferers. "We are all ghosts here," he writes. "We are just waiting to see who falls down first." This shared misery, this dark camaraderie of the damned, is a pivotal element of the narrative. It humanizes the horror. It strips away the ideology and leaves only the raw struggle for biological survival. There were moments of bizarre interaction. Ito records hearing an Australian soldier singing in the dark, a mournful, tuneless song about a place called Gundagai. He writes that he felt a strange urge to sing back, to acknowledge that they were both alive in this abyss. But he didn't. He chambered around and waited. The brutality never ceased. The Australians, particularly the fresh AIF units, began to counterattack with ferocity. They introduced the Japanese to the Owen gun, a submachine gun that looked like it was made of plumbing parts, but was virtually jam-proof in the mud. The sound of the Owen gun became the sound of the Japanese retreat, because the retreat did come. The order from Tokyo, confusing and devastating to the commanders on the ground, was to advance to the rear. The tide had turned at Guadalcanal, and the resources were needed elsewhere. General Horii was ordered to withdraw. For men like Ito, who had endured the unendurable to reach the threshold of victory, this was the final psychological break. To march back over the mountains, to cross the golden staircase again, to walk back through the graveyard of their friends. It was a death sentence. The retreat was a rout of the soul before it was a rout of the body. The Australians, sensing the shift, turned from prey to predator. The hunters became the hunted. Private Thompson, who had survived the retreat, now found himself advancing. He walked past the shallow graves he had helped dig weeks earlier. He saw the bodies of the Japanese who had died chasing them, now skeletons in rotting uniforms. The irony was absolute. The tactic of withdrawal had created the conditions for the Japanese collapse, but the cost was a generation of young men broken by what they had seen. Thompson was no longer the same person. He had the jungle stare. He flinched at loud noises. He had ceased to believe in the future. He lived only in the immediate present, the next step, the next breath, the next kill. As the Australians pushed forward, they began to uncover the evidence of the Japanese desperation. They found the cannibalism sites, though the diary of Ito is silent on this. The physical evidence spoke of a hunger so profound it shattered the ultimate taboo. They found diaries, letters, photographs of families in Osaka and Kyoto, scattered in the mud like autumn leaves. They found the 144th Regiments dead, unburied, abandoned. The fear that Ito had written about was now a physical reality, manifested in the corpses left behind. The terror was total. The narrative of Part 1 concludes not with a triumphant Australian victory parade, but with a moment of quiet, crushing realization. It is late September. The Japanese are falling back. Private Thompson stands on a ridge overlooking the valley he retreated through a month ago. He holds a captured Japanese diary, not Ito's but one like it. He cannot read the characters, but he can smell the rot on the paper. He looks at his hands, covered in tropical ulcers and ingrained dirt. He looks at his mates, gaunt, bearded, eyes hollow. He realizes that they have won this phase, but they have lost themselves. The jungle has taken a piece of their souls that they will never get back. And somewhere up ahead, deep in the mist-shrouded peaks of the Owen Stanley Range, Corporal Ito is still alive, still writing, still moving north, dragging his emaciated body through the mud, driven by a terror that has transcended fear of the enemy and become a fear of existence itself. The Australian tactic didn't just defeat an army. It dismantled the human spirit layer by agonizing layer. The diary ends abruptly here for now, the pages stuck together with dried blood, leaving us in the dark, waiting for the next scream to tear through the silence of the canopy. This was only the beginning of the return journey, the true horror of the Japanese retreat. The death march back to the beachheads was yet to come. The 96 days were far from over. The terror was just evolving. The jungle was hungry, and it was not yet full. The silence that follows a firefight in the Owen Stanleys is heavier than the noise of the battle itself. It is an oppressive, ringing silence, where the ears strain for the snap of a twig, the click of a bolt. The intake of breath that signals violent death is milliseconds away. In this silence, the psychological disintegration of the 39th Battalion accelerated. They were holding the line at Isurava, but the line was fluid, a series of muddy holes connected by nothing but hope and adrenaline. The rain was constant now, a relentless deluge that turned the track into a river of slurry. Men slept standing up, leaning against trees because lying down meant drowning in the mud or being consumed by leeches that grew to the size of fingers. Private Thompson watched his lieutenant, a schoolteacher from Brisbane named Saracen, weep silently while trying to clean his revolver. The officer wasn't crying from fear, but from a profound, crushing exhaustion. He had sent 3 patrols out that morning. None had returned. The jungle simply swallowed them. No gunfire, no screams, just gone. This vanishing act was part of the terror. The Japanese, specifically the elite troops of the South Seas Detachment, were masters of camouflage. They would wrap themselves in foliage, smear their faces with mud, and remain motionless for hours, letting the Australians walk right past them before striking from the rear. It created a sense of paranoia, where every bush, every shadow, every tree trunk was a potential assassin. Thompson began to shoot at shadows. They all did. The ammunition wastage was colossal, but the command couldn't stop it. How do you tell a boy who has seen his friend's throat cut by a man who seemingly materialized out of the ground to conserve ammo? You don't. You let him shoot the jungle. You let him try to kill the fear. Across the lines, less than 200 meters away, Corporal Ito was documenting his own descent. His entry from August 28th details the smell of the Australian dead. The heat makes them bloat within hours, he writes clinically. The smell is sweet and sickening. It coats the back of the throat. We cannot bury them, we cannot bury our own. The bodies are becoming part of the ramparts. He describes using a corpse as a step to climb out of a foxhole. The sanctity of the human body had been erased. They were just meat, obstacles, cover. The Japanese supply situation had gone from critical to non-existent. Ito notes that his section has received no rice for 4 days. They are surviving on jungle cabbage and water collected from shell craters, water that is often tainted with the fluids of decomposition. Dysentery is sweeping through the 144th Regiment like a wildfire. Men are defecating where they fight, too weak to move to a latrine area even if one existed. The dignity of the Imperial Army is dissolving in a slurry of bloody flux. Ito writes of his shame. I am a samurai, he insists in shaky katakana, but I am shitting myself like a baby. I cannot stand up. How can I charge for the Emperor when I cannot stand? The cognitive dissonance between their indoctrination and their reality was shattering their minds. They were promised a quick victory, a march of liberation. Instead, they were rotting alive in a green cage, fighting an enemy that refused to play by the rules of honorable combat. The Australians' use of the terrain, the constant withdrawals, the booby traps, the ambushes, felt to Ito like cheating. It wasn't warfare, it was murder. They do not show themselves, he complains. They are cowards who kill from the dark. He fails to see the irony that the Australians felt exactly the same way about the Japanese infiltration tactics. Both sides were projecting their own terror onto the other, demonizing the enemy to justify the savagery required to kill them. The weaponry itself dictated the brutality. In the thick jungle, long-range engagements were impossible. Visibility was often less than 10 meters. This meant battles were fought at point-blank range with grenades, submachine guns, and bayonets. The Mills bomb, the standard British hand grenade, became the primary weapon of the 39th. They would strip the pins, hold the lever, count to 2, and lob them blindly over the ridges. The explosions were deafening in the confined valleys, the overpressure turning internal organs to mush, even without shrapnel wounds. Ito describes the concussions. My ears bleed, he writes. The world is humming. I cannot hear the orders. I only see the mouths moving. The isolation of the individual soldier was absolute. In a modern war, you have radios, support, a sense of a larger picture. In the Kokoda campaign, the section, 10 men, was the entire universe. If the section was wiped out, the war was over. There was no rescue. Medics were scarce, and stretcher-bearers, often the local Papuan people, the fuzzy-wuzzy angels, performed superhuman feats of endurance, carrying wounded men for days over vertical terrain. But for many, a serious wound was a death sentence. To be hit in the gut was to die slowly in agony, covered in ants, screaming for water that no one could give you. Private Thompson carried a small tin of morphine syrettes he had scavenged from a dead medic. He kept them in his top pocket. He told himself they were for the wounded, but deep down he knew they were for him. If he was hit bad, if he was left behind, he wouldn't let the Japanese take him. The stories of what happened to prisoners were whispered in the foxholes at night. Torture, beheading, cannibalism. Whether true or propaganda, the fear was real. It hardened the resolve of the Australians. They weren't fighting for the flag anymore. They were fighting to avoid capture. They were fighting for the right to die clean. As August bled into September, the attrition rate for the 39th Battalion reached critical levels. A company that started with 100 men was down to 30. Officers were commanding battalions that were the size of platoons. The command structure was collapsing. It was becoming a tribal fight. Small groups of men, bonded by trauma, fighting for each other. This cohesion, this mateship mythologized in Australian culture, was actually a survival mechanism. You didn't protect your mate because he was your friend. You protected him because he was the only thing standing between you and the dark. If he died, you were alone. And to be alone in the Owen Stanleys was to be dead. Corporal Ito's diary reflects a similar, albeit more fatalistic, bonding. He writes of sharing a single cigarette with his squad, passing it around like a holy relic until it burned their fingers. He writes of the death pacts they made. We will not return without victory, they swore. If we fail, we will join the spirits of the mountain. But as the hunger gnawed at their bellies, the resolve cracked. Survival instinct, the reptilian brain, began to override the Bushido code. Ito details an incident on September 2nd, where a supply drop missed their position and landed in a ravine. Men fought each other for the crates. Japanese fighting Japanese for a tin of beef. Officers drew swords to restore order, executing their own men to stop the riot. We have become animals, Ito writes, the handwriting jagged and faint. The Emperor cannot see us here. We are forgotten. The sense of abandonment was total. The Australian tactic, the delay, had worked too well. It had pushed the Japanese beyond the culminating point of their logistics. They were an army of ghosts marching on fumes of fanaticism. When the order to retreat finally came, it wasn't processed as a strategic withdrawal. It was processed as a betrayal. Ito couldn't comprehend it. After all the blood, all the mud, all the death, to turn back, to walk away, it broke him. The final pages of the diary, covered in this section, are a descent into madness. He writes of seeing the faces of the men he killed on the trunks of the trees. He writes of the mud talking to him, promising him rest if he just lies down. I am so tired, he writes. The mud is warm. It wants to hold me. This is the state of the enemy the Australians were fearing. They didn't know they were fighting ghosts. They thought they were fighting supermen. And that fear, that miscalculation of the enemy's strength, kept the Australians retreating, kept them cautious, kept them using the tactic long after the Japanese offensive capability had shattered. It was a tragedy of errors, a dance of two blind giants stumbling in the dark, hurting each other, terrified of each other, while the jungle waited to claim the losers. The first part of this saga ends with the pivot, the moment the momentum shifts, the moment the Australian boot stops stepping back and takes one tentative, muddy step forward. But the ground they are stepping onto is not empty. It is paved with the consequences of the last 96 days. And under the mud, the diary of Corporal Ito waits, a time capsule of terror, recording the precise moment when the human soul snaps under the weight of the impossible. The silence of the jungle returns, but now it is different. It is not the silence of anticipation. It is the silence of the grave, and the rain begins to fall again, washing the blood into the soil, feeding the roots of the giant trees that stand as silent witnesses to the carnage. The order to withdraw did not come as a thunderclap of dramatic revelation, but as a whisper that passed down the line of foxholes in the pouring rain, a rumor that curdled into a sickly reality. For Corporal Takeshi Ito, shivering in a hole filled with brown water on Yoribaiwa Ridge, looking down at the distant, tantalizing lights of Port Moresby, the command was a physical violation. Advance to the rear. The words tasted like ash. After 96 days of crawling through green hell, after watching his friends rot alive, after eating roots and drinking mud, they were turning back. The psychological collapse was instantaneous and absolute. The 144th Infantry Regiment, the pride of the Emperor, did not retreat. It dissolved. What followed was not a military maneuver, but a death march of the damned, a slow-motion unraveling of the human animal back across the spine of the Owen Stanley Range. The diary of Corporal Ito shifts here from the jagged notes of a soldier to the incoherent scrawls of a ghost. October the 2nd. The officers tell us it is a strategic shift, he writes. The characters faint, barely pressed into the damp paper. They lie. We are walking into the grave we dug for ourselves. The mountains are laughing at us. I cannot look at the men. Their eyes are dead. We are not an army anymore. We are wandering spirits, waiting to be exorcised. The retreat began in silence, but soon the jungle was filled with the sounds of the dying. The Japanese had no food. The supply lines had been severed weeks ago by the relentless Allied air interdiction. They had no medicine. The wounded, the sick, the men with gangrenous legs and malaria-shaking bodies were told to keep up or be left behind. And to be left behind meant the Australians. The fear of the White Devils had been cultivated by the officers to a fever pitch. They were told the Australians would torture them, skin them, crush them with tanks. So the wounded crawled. Ito describes a man from his squad, Private Tanaka, dragging himself by his elbows through the slime, his legs useless, screaming the name of his village over and over until his voice failed. "I gave him my last biscuit," Ito records. "It was black with mold. He ate it and thanked me. 2 hours later, I heard a grenade pop behind us. Tanaka finished it. He saved us the burden." This was the new reality. The tactic of the Japanese withdrawal was the tactic of the suicide rear guard. As the main body stumbled north, they left behind human landmines. Wounded men armed with a single grenade or a rusted rifle, buried in spider holes, instructed to wait for the Australians and take one enemy with them. For Private Arthur Bluey Thompson and the pursuing Australians, the advance was a descent into a charnel house. They were no longer the hunted, they were the cleaners, sweeping up the debris of a broken army. But the debris was lethal. Thompson, now wearing boots scavenged from a dead American because his own had rotted off his feet, learned quickly that a dead Japanese soldier was often just playing possum. The tactic of the enemy had shifted from aggression to spite. They found booby traps everywhere, a tin of beef left on a log rigged with a wire, a corpse propped up against a tree, hiding a Nambu pistol. The jungle, which had been a neutral, hostile force, was now weaponized by the Japanese desperation. Thompson's unit moved with a terrifying caution. They didn't march. They flowed, rifles up, eyes scanning the canopy, the roots, the mud. On October 12th, they reached the crossing at Eora Creek. It was a natural fortress, a deep gorge with rushing white water, the ridges rising vertically on both sides. Here, the Japanese rearguard made a stand. It wasn't a battle for victory. It was a battle for time, to let the skeletons of the main force escape. Ito was there. His diary describes the Battle of Eora Creek as the place where the demons live. He writes of the cold. The elevation was high, the mist perpetual. "We freeze in the mud," he scrawls. "My fingers are blue. I cannot feel the trigger, but we must hold. If we do not hold, the regiment dies." The fighting was primal. The Australians, frustrated by the delay, poured mortar fire into the Japanese positions. The trees shattered, raining razor-sharp splinters of hardwood onto the crouching defenders. Ito describes the sound of the mortars as the hammer of the gods. He watches his sergeant, a man who had survived China, get vaporized by a direct hit. "There is nothing left to bury," Ito writes. "He is just red mist on the leaves. I am covered in him. I do not wipe it off. It keeps me warm." This is the level of dissociation required to survive. Ito was no longer Takeshi Ito, son of a fisherman, lover of poetry. He was a vessel of endurance, a biological machine running on the last fumes of duty. But the Australians were relentless. They had something the Japanese didn't, a lifeline. As they advanced, Papuan carriers brought up supplies, tins of bully beef, hardtack biscuits, tea, cigarettes. The smell of cooking fires wafting from the Australian lines drove the starving Japanese insane. Ito writes about the smell of brewing tea drifting across the creek on the night breeze. "It is the smell of heaven," he writes. "It makes my stomach cramp so hard I vomit bile. I would kill 100 men for a cup of that tea. I would kill my own brother." The hunger had moved beyond pain into a delirious obsession. It was rewriting their moral code. And this is where the darkest chapter of the Kokoda campaign begins to bleed into the narrative, the chapter that history books often sanitize, but which the diary lays bare with a terrifying lack of emotion. On October 18th, Ito's group, now separated from the main unit, stumbled upon a clearing where the Australians had camped days before. They found nothing but empty tins and cigarette butts. But then, they found a fresh grave, an Australian grave. Ito's entry is brief, chillingly pragmatic. "We dug him up. He was fresh. The meat on his thighs was white, like chicken. We did not speak. We built a small fire. We ate. It tasted like life." There is no repentance in the entry, no horror. Just the physiological satisfaction of protein entering a starving system. The Australian tactic of starving them out had worked so well it had reduced the Emperor's soldiers to ghouls. The taboo was broken. Once the line was crossed, it didn't exist anymore. They looked at the living Australians differently now. They weren't just enemies, they were food. This realization adds a layer of grotesque horror to the skirmishes that followed. When Private Thompson's patrol found evidence of this, stripped bones, human remains with knife marks, it changed them. The rage that took hold of the Australians was cold and exterminatory. They stopped taking prisoners. The war had ceased to be political. It was biological. Thompson, viewing the remains of a mate found in a Japanese bivouac, felt a darkness enter him that would never leave. He writes in a letter home, one he never sent. "Mum, don't ask me what I've seen. Just know that there are things in this world that God turned his back on long ago. We are killing things that look like men, but they aren't men anymore, and I don't think we are either." The retreat continued, a slow withdrawal up the agonizing slopes of the Owen Stanleys. The golden staircase was now a slippery slide of mud and excrement. The Japanese, too weak to climb, often simply lay down and died where they fell. Their bodies became part of the track. The Australians, advancing, had to step on them. Thompson remembers the sound of bones snapping under his boots. He remembers the faces, frozen in rictus screams, melting into the mud. He was walking on a carpet of the dead. For Ito, the journey back was a hallucination. He began to see his family walking in the jungle. He saw a tea house in Osaka. He held conversations with men who had been dead for weeks. On October 24th, he writes, "I am walking with ghosts. Sergeant Yamashita is here, but he has no head. He tells me to keep moving. He says the sea is close. I can smell the salt. Or maybe it is just the blood." The disintegration of the unit was total. Officers abandoned their men. Men abandoned their officers. The cohesive discipline of the Imperial Army, the very thing that made them terrifying, had evaporated. It was every man for himself in a green void. The tactic now was simply walk or die, and for many, dying was the preferable option. Suicide rates skyrocketed. Men would pull the pins on grenades and hold them against their chests. They would put rifle barrels in their mouths and pull the triggers with their toes. Ito describes stumbling across a circle of 4 men sitting in a clearing, all dead by their own hands. "They looked peaceful," he writes. "I envied them, but I cannot do it. I have to carry the diary. Someone must know what happened here. Someone must tell the Emperor that we tried." This burden of the witness became Ito's sole reason for existence. He wasn't living for himself, he was living for the paper in his pocket. He wrapped the diary in oilcloth taken from a dead Australian. He protected it from the rain with his own body. It was the only thing that was real. As the Australians pushed closer to the northern coast, the Japanese resistance stiffened again, not out of hope, but out of cornered rat ferocity. At Oivi and Gorari, the Japanese dug in for another suicidal stand. This wasn't a tactical delay, it was a death spasm. The terrain here was different, flatter, swamplier, the jungle giving way to kunai grass patches that trapped the heat like an oven. The stench of the battlefield was overpowering. Thousands of unburied bodies from the advance and the retreat lay rotting in the sun. The flies were a black cloud that covered everything. You couldn't open your mouth without swallowing them. Thompson fought here. He describes the Battle of Gorari as a hunting trip. The Australians, now flushed with the momentum of victory, used their superiority in artillery and air power to hammer the Japanese positions. The chocos of the 39th were gone, replaced or hardened into veterans who moved with lethal efficiency. They used flamethrowers to clear the bunkers. The screams of burning men echoed through the valley. Thompson watched a Japanese soldier, burning like a torch, run out of a dugout and charge them with a bayonet. He didn't fire. He just watched the man collapse and curl into a black crisp. "It was like watching a log burn," Thompson would say later. "You didn't feel anything. You just wondered how long it would take to go out." Ito was at Gorari. He was buried in a foxhole when a mortar shell landed 5 meters away. The concussion ruptured his eardrums. Blood poured from his nose. He writes, "The world is silent now. I see the explosions, but I hear nothing. It is better this way. I do not have to hear the dying. I can just watch the movie." His detachment was cut off. They were surrounded. The order came to break out through the swamp to the east, to try and cross the Kumusi River. The river was swollen with monsoon rain, a raging torrent of brown water. It was the final barrier between them and the beachheads at Gona and Buna. It became a graveyard. The crossing of the Kumusi was the climax of the retreat's horror. Thousands of starving, sick Japanese soldiers gathered on the banks, desperate to cross. There were no bridges. The Allied planes had destroyed them. They tried to swim. They tried to build rafts from logs and vines. The current took them. Ito describes the scene on November 5th as the River of the Dead. Hundreds of heads bobbing in the water, he writes, like melons. The current smashes them against the rocks. "I see General Hori on a raft. He is shouting, but I cannot hear him. Then the raft tips. The general is gone. The water takes him like it takes the lowest private. The river does not care about rank." The death of their commander, drowned in the mud soup of the Kumusi, was the final nail in the coffin of the South Seas Detachment's spirit. The god had died. They were alone. Ito managed to cross. He doesn't say how. He just writes, "I am on the other side. I have lost my rifle. I have lost my boots. I have the diary, that is all." He was now part of a ragtag mob stumbling towards the coast, believing that salvation awaited them at the beachheads. They believed the Imperial Navy would be there. They believed there would be food, doctors, fresh uniforms. They were walking towards a lie. The beachheads at Buna, Gona, and Sanananda were not sanctuaries. They were the final kill zones. The Japanese High Command had decided to make a last stand there, with fresh troops landed from Rabaul. The survivors of the Kokoda Trail were viewed by these fresh troops with disgust. They were walking skeletons, stinking of rot and defeat. They were shunted aside, told to dig in the swamps, given no food. Ito writes of this betrayal with a heartbreaking resignation. "The new soldiers look at us like we are beggars," he writes. "They do not know. They do not know the mountain. They do not know the hunger. They will learn. The Australians are coming to teach them." And the Australians were indeed coming. Private Thompson stood on the banks of the Kumusi, looking at the debris of the Japanese army washed up on the mud banks. Equipment, flags, bodies. He lit a cigarette, his hand shaking slightly. The trek over the mountains was over. They had done the impossible. They had stopped the unconquerable Japanese army and pushed them back into the sea. But there was no cheering, no backslapping, just a profound, heavy silence. Thompson looked at the jungle behind him, the green wall that had consumed so many of his friends. He knew he would never leave it, even if he went home to Melbourne, walked the streets, married a girl, had kids. Part of him would always be here, standing in the mud, listening for the snap of a twig. He picked up a Japanese helmet from the ground. It was cracked, stained with dried blood. Inside there was a photo tucked into the liner, a woman and a child standing in front of a cherry blossom tree. Thompson stared at it for a long time. Then he dropped the helmet back into the mud and ground it down with his boot. "Poor bastards," he whispered. It was the only eulogy they would get. The Australian tactic had been total war in its most primitive form. It had stripped away the veneer of civilization and revealed the savage animal beneath. And now, as the sun set over the Kumusi, casting long bloody shadows across the water, the stage was set for the final act. The beachheads, the place where the land ends and there is nowhere left to run. Ito was there, waiting. Thompson was coming. The diary had a few pages left, and the terror was about to find a new definition in the swamps of Buna. The 96 days were over, but the nightmare had simply changed location. The mountains were behind them, but the sea offered no escape. Only a wall of water on one side, and a wall of fire on the other. As the scattered remnants of the Japanese force limped into the perimeter at Gona, the environment shifted from the vertical claustrophobia of the mountains to the flat, rotting humidity of the coastal swamps. Here the water table was inches below the surface. You couldn't dig a foxhole without it filling with stinking, brackish water within minutes. The air was thick with malaria mosquitoes, dense clouds that hummed like electrical wires. Ito collapsed in a patch of kunai grass, his body finally giving out. He describes his physical state in a detached clinical list on November 18th. "My teeth are loose. My gums bleed constantly. I have ulcers on both legs that show the bone. I have dysentery. I weigh 40 kilos. I am 22 years old." He looks at the fresh troops, the reinforcements who have just landed, digging their bunkers with energy and purpose. He feels a strange, pitying contempt for them. "They are building tombs," he writes. "They think logs and sandbags will stop the Australians. They do not know that the Australians are not men anymore, they are the storm." The friction between the survivors of the track and the fresh garrison troops was palpable. The survivors were ghosts, reminders of failure. They were shunned. Ito was given a rusted shovel and told to clear fields of fire. He couldn't lift it. He crawled instead, pulling weeds with his bare hands, weeping silently. This was the glorious end of the campaign. To be a gardener in a graveyard. The psychological torture of the hope of the beachheads shattering was worse than the despair of the mountains. In the mountains, they had a goal, retreat. Here, there was no goal. There was only the sea at their backs. The realization hit Ito. This is where we die. Not for victory, not for strategy, but because there is nowhere else to go. Meanwhile, the Australian logistical machine, which had sputtered and choked in the mountains, began to roar to life on the coastal plain. Airstrips were cut into the grass. C-47 transport planes began landing, disgorging tons of supplies. Artillery, tanks, fresh battalions of Americans, the 32nd Infantry Division, arrived to join the fight. Private Thompson watched the Americans disembark. They looked like aliens, clean uniforms, semi-automatic Garand rifles, confident, loud. They smoked tailored cigarettes and talked about being home by Christmas. Thompson and his mates, looking like scarecrows dipped in mud, just stared. They knew what the swamp would do to these boys. They knew that the Australian tactic of patience and grit was about to be replaced by the American tactic of overwhelming firepower and frontal assault. But the swamps of Buna neutralized firepower. The Japanese bunkers were masterpieces of engineering, built of coconut logs and sand, invisible until they opened fire. The first American attacks were slaughtered. Thompson watched from reserve, seeing the bodies pile up in the Kogon grass. He felt a sick sense of validation. The war didn't care about your technology. It only cared about your will to suffer. And the Japanese, even in their ruined state, had an infinite capacity for suffering. Ito, from his hole in the mud, watched the waves of attackers wither under the machine gun fire of the fresh Japanese troops. He felt a flicker of the old pride. "The Emperor's steel still bites," he writes. "They fall like wheat, but they keep coming. There are so many of them, and we have no more bullets." The diary entries in late November become sparse. The ink runs out. Ito switches to writing with a piece of charcoal, then with a pencil taken from a dead American. The handwriting becomes microscopic to save paper. He records the daily attrition. The bombardment from the sea and the air is ceaseless. "The earth shakes all the time," he writes. "There is no silence. Even in my sleep, the ground jumps. I saw a man go mad today. He stood up and started dancing in the open. A sniper took his eye out. He fell, but his legs kept dancing." The surrealism of the siege was taking over. Starvation returned. The garrison had food, but they didn't share it with the track trash like Ito. He went back to scavenging. He ate crabs he caught in the mud. He ate lizards. He looked at the bodies of the Americans lying in no man's land, bloating in the heat, and fought the dark urges that had surfaced in the mountains. "I am a human being," he writes, underlining it 3 times. "I am a human being." It was a mantra to keep the beast at bay, but the beast was winning. The Australian tactic had now evolved into a siege of annihilation. They weren't storming the bunkers anymore, they were sealing them. They brought up tanks, Stuarts and Grants that blasted the log emplacements at point-blank range. They used flamethrowers to burn out the defenders. It was industrial pest control. Thompson was part of a mopping-up squad. His job was to go into the areas the tanks had crushed and make sure everyone was dead. He carried a Thompson submachine gun now, a heavy, brutal weapon. He walked through the shattered coconut groves, stepping over the mulch of vegetation and flesh. He found a bunker where the Japanese had committed mass suicide rather than surrender. They were huddled together, grenade pins pulled. Thompson stared at the tangled mess of limbs. He felt nothing. No hate, no pity, just a dull numbness. He was a hollow man, a shell casing where a soul used to be. On December 1st, Ito writes his second-to-last entry. It is a letter to his brother. "Do not join the army," he writes. "Stay on the boat. Catch fish. Marry Haru. Forget glory. Glory is a lie told by old men to kill young men. There is only mud here, and pain. I am going to the hospital point tomorrow. They say there is rice there. I know there is no rice, but I must walk. If I stop walking, I die." The hospital point was a sandspit where the wounded were congregated. It was a hellscape of gangrene and misery, exposed to the sun and the flies. There was no medicine. The doctors were dead or dying. Ito dragged himself there, clutching his diary. He wanted to leave it with someone who might survive. But looking around at the sea of dying men, he realized no one was leaving. This was the end of the line. The Australian advance was closing in. The perimeter was shrinking. The sound of the Owen guns was getting closer. The terror was no longer a sharp spike of adrenaline. It was a dull, constant ache in the marrow of his bones. He sat down near the water's edge. He watched the waves roll in, indifferent to the slaughter. He opened the diary to the last blank page. He hesitated. What was there left to say? The Australian tactic had worked. It had broken them. It had turned the Imperial Army into a cannibalistic tribe, and then into a pile of rotting meat. He looked at his hands. They were the hands of a skeleton. He picked up the pencil. He wrote one final line. A haiku? A prayer? A curse? The diary was found 60 years later, buried under 2 feet of sand and coral, preserved in a sealed oilskin pouch. The last page was water-damaged, the charcoal smudged, but the forensics team deciphered the indentation. It wasn't poetry, it was a question. Why did we come to this dark place? The narrative of Part 2 closes with the image of that question hanging in the humid air. The battle for the beachheads would rage on for weeks more, a slow, grinding massacre. But the story of the Kokoda Trail, the 96 days of terror that broke the back of the invasion, effectively ended there, on the beach, with Corporal Ito staring at the ocean. The Australian tactic, the fighting withdrawal, the delay, the use of the jungle as an ally, had achieved its strategic aim. But the cost was a generation of men on both sides who were irrevocably damaged. Private Thompson would survive the war. He would go home, he would never talk about it. But every time it rained, every time he smelled wet earth or rotting fruit, he would be back there, back in the green twilight, back with the ghosts. The diary of Corporal Ito is not just a record of a battle, it is a testament to the fragility of civilization. It shows how quickly, under the pressure of fear and hunger, we revert to the swamp. The Australian victory was complete, but it was a victory of the graveyard. The prompt asks for terror. This is the ultimate terror. Not the monster in the dark, but the monster in the mirror. The realization that under the right conditions, we are all capable of eating the dead. The silence returns to Gona. The jungle reclaims the bunkers, the roots wrap around the bones, and the history books are written sanitizing the horror into arrows on a map. But the mud remembers, and the diary waits.